All right, everyone. Thanks for joining Coach's Corner again. Tonight we have Leroy Mclennan from Rise Health Group, as well as Rehab Coordinator down at Frankston, VFL. Leroy comes at things from a really good angle where he's a physiotherapist, but as well he's an S&C coach. So he sees both sides of the lens, which gives him a really good basis of understanding as well as practical application. This hamstrings injuries one with the sprinting focus is going to be good. I know I've had a quick chat to him a couple of weeks ago where we just sat there and threw out ideas, and he comes at things from a good perspective, a unique perspective, and opens up all different elements to why injuries occur, how they occur, and how we can fix them. So I'm going to throw over to Leroy, and the floor is yours, mate.
Beautiful, mate. Beautiful. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Beautiful. All right. Thanks, Jared, for having me, obviously. Pleasure to be on here. Pleasure to back up, I guess, some of the amazing talks that we've had so far. Hoping that my one, in some ways, might just be a little bit different compared to what we've had previously. I know we've had a bit of a focus on maybe some more general principles, general approaches, and stuff like that. So I'm kind of hoping to dive a bit down the rabbit hole here and go probably more a mile deep and an inch wide, if anything else. I guess before we get started, I've very deliberately included the word complex in here somewhere because I think what I'm aiming to present on today is quite a complex topic, depending on how deep you go and how deep you look. So I've tried really, really hard, and it's absolutely killed me over the last week to try and make something that I think is a bit complex, try and simplify it without oversimplifying as well. So that's my challenge today. Bit on me to start with, which Jared just introduced me. I do have a few different perspectives. I like to think of myself first and foremost as an athlete performance coach. I got into physio with the idea or the motivation to try and help make myself and athletes better. So I think my initial motivation for being a physio was to, I guess, pursue more athletic focused tasks and athletic focused ambitions. And then secondly, I am a physiotherapist as well. I've got inverted commas here. I'm a budding researcher, I guess. I'd love to get into the research field, and I do as much reading and stuff as I can. And I do have a very research focused mindset at times, but I think I combine that as well with maybe more practical, more realist type thought processes too. And then in double quotation marks, I'm an athlete in some ways, but I sort of think of myself as a jack of all trades and a master of none, really. In my younger days, I played a lot of elite sport, played soccer at a youth level relatively high-ish and was relatively good. And at the same time, competed a lot in distance running, especially sort of anywhere between 800 meters and 5K. And again, was relatively good at that. Never truly elite, never truly the best at any of these, but relatively good at both of those. Then went to uni, threw all that out straight away, took up powerlifting and have sort of competed semi-seriously, but also not at a huge high level for probably the last 6 years, 7 years or so. And now that I have no weights and stuff, I've sort of thrown that out the window and have started taking up sprinting and speed work as well, just as a personal interest in something that I've been passionate about for a few years now. I'm passionate about coaching. So I think from an athlete, from an N=1 point of view, I've seen a fair bit in my time as well at all sorts of ends of the extreme too. So plan of attack for today, I've sort of broken it up into 3 separate parts. Part one, the complexity of sprinting. And I think, like I said at the start, trying to highlight why this is a complex topic. And then the part 2 and part 3, I guess, trying to break it down and make it a little bit easier. So I've deliberately put a little halftime Q&A break after that part 1 there. That's probably going to be most of the discussion, maybe half the discussion thereabouts. And I want us to stop and just sort of have a sec to think about maybe some of the stuff that I've spoken about already. So very conveniently placed halftime Q&A there. Plus, it also means that when I run overtime at the end, I can blame that time period for it as well. So, complexity of sprinting. I think a really, really good starting point here is, and there's already a typo, is the ALTIS, ALTIS kilogram method. For those of you who don't know, ALTIS are a really, really elite training facility over in the States who specialize more or less in track and field athletes. And they've put together a really, really cool sprint analysis method called the kilogram method, more or less. We'd really, really strongly encourage, if you're not aware of this, they've got a really cool PDF that's a little bit long, 30 to 40 pages long, maybe not even, I don't know, but goes into this really, really thoroughly. When people talk about a technical model for sprinting, I think more often than not, they're referencing this model. So I think this is a really, really good starting point to read through and just sort of dip your toe in the water and then build on top of that. I think that's how I've approached it. And I found that very, very useful. More or less what they do, they break, I guess, the gait cycle up into 5 different parts, as you see here. And then they've sort of got a big list of criteria at each part that we want to analyze and we want to look at and we want to figure out. Now, I think there's obviously some pros and cons of everything, but pros and cons here, I think it's created by 2, but more or less their whole team, but 2 of the smartest track coaches in the world, Stu McMillan and Dan Paff. It's very, very detailed. It goes into more detail than us mere mortals could ever wish to get on top of. Their results speak for themselves. I think they've got a few gold medals to their name in terms of athletes that they've coached, which in the track and field level, having a few athletes with medals speaks volumes. There's quite a few people who have one medal. They have results that have spanned quite a long period of time and have achieved quite a fair bit. And for this method, you really only need a slow-mo camera too. So it's easy. We can all do it. We've all got a slow-mo camera in our pocket, more or less. The cons, technical model for track sprinting, which we're going to talk about that in a sec, but technical models have received a bit of shit lately, and we'll chat about that why. But it is designed for track sprinting. It's not designed for team sports, although there are takeaways for team sports. It is designed predominantly for track sprinting. I've got very, very detailed as a con as well. It's one of those paralysis by analysis things where there's so much detail. Like I said, I think it's 30 to 40 pages on just interpreting a few photographs, which if you're new to it, can be a bit overwhelming. But like I said, I think it's a really, really good starting point. The 2 main cons here that I hope to discuss a bit are that the kilogram method, if we go back to here, it reveals the signs, or it reveals, the signs of something, but not necessarily the causes, why something is happening. It shows us what is happening, but doesn't show us why, which that's just the tool that it is. It's not claiming to do so, but I think it's important to think about that. The other con is that, I guess, how do we know what is optimal? Altus obviously suggests that they've got their optimal model, but there are going to be issues in transferring that to other athletes who are not necessarily track and field athletes. So I think we just need to be careful what we define as optimal. What does optimal even mean? So technical model for track and sprinting is a con. Here's one, or something that's been pretty highly publicised over the last year or 2. Chelsea coach, who I can never remember his name because I'm not big enough in soccer, unfortunately, suggested that they've never seen a player, or he's never seen a player with a weight on the pitch. And so therefore, none of their players back in 2018 or 2019, whenever this was a thing, none of their players did any weight sessions. And S&C industry, rightfully so, kicked up a big stink and said, no, that's bullshit, which it is. It's absolutely terrible logic, terrible reasoning. I don't like that. Coach should be sacked, rah, 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 rah. But then at the same time, recently, we've got an argument suggesting that team sport athletes don't sprint the same as sprinters, which, again, we all know. And then we use that, or some people use that as justification that technical models, because team sport athletes don't sprint the same way as sprinters, our technical models should be thrown out, and our technical models have, I guess, minimal use. But to me, it's sort of the same argument by both people. One saying that they've never seen a weight on the pitch, they've never seen their athletes moving that way out on the pitch, so why the hell would you do it in gym? And then the same, I guess, mindset here of they don't see their athletes sprinting like sprinters, so why should we use a technical model developed by sprinters? And so they're kind of, to me, the same picture, more or less. This is exactly the same argument on both sides. It's just a slightly different take on it. And I think it's important to identify that inconsistency now. I think technical models, as we'll speak about, technical models can be extremely useful for certain things, just like doing weights, lifting in the gym. That's not how we move out the soccer pitch, but it's also extremely useful. It's going to develop certain qualities and whatnot that can't be trained out in the pitch, similar to what our technical models will enable us to do with our sprinting and speed work. So generally, we've got two questions we need to answer. Number one is, what is the problem? Number two is, what is the cause of the problem? And I think these are two different questions, but I think sometimes we fail to see that. What is the problem might be that when someone is running, they do something stupid, they've got some sort of silly technical issue there, but that's not the cause of the problem. The cause of the problem might be that their hammy is about to rip off the bone because it's that tight, or that it's that weak, or that there's something else happening that we can't physically see, but that is the cause of the problem. Hence, it's kind of no good fixing one and not the other. We need to think about every problem in terms of, what actually is the problem? What are we seeing that is an issue? But what is causing that as well? And it's kind of a bit of a chicken or the egg type scenario there. So, good looking rooster here on the left is myself about 5 or 6 months ago, I think, back when I just started to get into some sprinting stuff. Guy on the right, I'm not too sure. I probably should know who he is, but here's the reference standard used by Altus. Quick little geese here. There's quite a few differences between the two of us, and understandably so. He's probably been training for the last 20 years for what he's doing there, and I've been doing it for about a month. Key thing here, and Jared, I'm looking at you at the moment. Can you see my mouse moving around, mate?
Yep.
Beautiful. Key thing here that I'll draw attention to is have a look at this angle, this extension angle or extension range at my hip here. I've got sweet bugger all. Compare that with our athlete over here, and he's got heaps. Now, at this point in time, I'm not suggesting that that's a major issue or anything like that, but there are differences. And our kilogram model here allows us to look at, how do I look compared to how does he look? I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, although in this case, given it's me and given it's him, it's probably a major thing. But the kilogram model allows us to compare the two and see, how do I differ compared to how he's running? So again, technical models tell us, how does my athlete move? But we need to be able to figure out the more important question of, why does my athlete move that way? So we go back to here, we can see I'm moving different to him. That's a given. And it's not just at the hip, but I'm going to sort of keep referencing the hip and using that as a bit of an example where I really don't push. I really don't get much in extension range when sprinting. There's arm stuff going on. The other leg's doing some funky stuff too, but focus on the hip. So we know that there's a difference, but we need to know why. Why does my athlete move that way? And I think that's probably the most important question that I could possibly pose this whole presentation is, we need to keep asking why. Why does that happen? Don't just look at something and think, oh, there's a difference there. That's the problem, or that's the source of the problem. No. We need to dive deeper than that. We need to think about, why does my athlete move that way? So to truly evaluate this, we need to consider a few key concepts, and these aren't an exhaustive list, but I think these are the way that I think. First is context, second is self-organization, and third is, what is optimal mechanics. So to quote champion last week, Cam Elliott, whose presentation I loved, context is king, and I certainly agree. We firstly need to consider the context of the situation. So what are the athlete's previous experiences? Have they done little athletics when they're younger? Have they been sprinting for ages? Have they torn a hammy? Have they had a bad experience when running? Are they slow? Do they think of themselves as slow? We also need to think about, what is the athlete's current physical status? And I mean that in a sense of generally everything. Are they tired? Are they fatigued? Do they feel good? But also, are they strong? Are they weak? Are they powerful? Are they quick? Are they slow? More specifically, do they have great hip extension power? Do they have poor hip extension power? Everything that makes us us from a physical point of view is what I'm incorporating there. What are the athlete's goals for this movement? We need to think about, is our athlete aiming to sprint in a straight line as fast as possible? Or is our athlete trying to evade someone who's chasing them? They're both very, very different goals. They might seem like the same resulting movement, but they're very different goals as well. And then finally, and probably the most tangible, is what environment is the athlete operating in? Sprinting on the track is very different to sprinting on grass, which is very different to sprinting on sand, which is very different to sprinting on a hill, uphill, downhill. So we need to know the context. And once we know the context, we can sort of put that to the side and start considering the next 2 points, which I think are just as important, but probably more important to dive into a bit. So 2020, Leroy, self-organization is also king. I think self-organization is a very, very underspoken or underrated concept that we probably don't get taught in undergrad uni at all in the slightest. And even some of the postgrad stuff that I've dived into as well hasn't really mentioned this. I guess a quick definition that I've come up myself: for a given context, which we've just outlined, and with appropriate practice and repetition, an athlete will self-organize their movement pattern to produce the most optimum pattern that satisfies their context. So if we go back a slide to this context is king, like I said, we're considering all aspects of the context there. Given that context, there is going to be self-organization occurring when an athlete runs, when an athlete moves, when an athlete does anything, where through trial and error, they're going to figure stuff out and they're going to move in a way that is optimum or optimal for that context and for themselves. And that's what I mean by if we've got a really weak athlete, they're going to move in a slightly different way compared to a really strong athlete or a really tired athlete as well. This self-organization concept, though, I think we need to be mindful that there's a reason as to why our athletes self-organize into the patterns that they do, based on the task that they're doing, which in our case today is more or less sprinting, based on the context, which is going to be athlete and environment specific, and based on our athletes' characteristics, they're going to adopt a pattern that works best for them. And I think a nice, quick example here is when you jump on a bike, you can get all the feedback from your coach, which is often your parents, regarding how you should ride that bike. But at the end of the day, you kind of need to fall over a few times. You need to wobble. You need to feel that, and you need to try and come up with a movement solution to solve that problem of learning how to ride a bike. So you're going to adopt over time and over practice a solution that works for that environment and is going to be most optimum. So if we go back to this fine example here, as we sort of identified, looking at my stance leg hip, I really don't go into much extension. So we've identified that that's a thing. Now we need to ask why. Why do I move that way when sprinting? And there's quite a few ways that we could look at it. We could think, as I said before, I've a bit of a powerlifting background. I'm a strong athlete. I'm certainly in no way, shape, or form a fast or a powerful athlete. Is it a case of I just don't move my legs very far? I don't have a huge, big stride length because, I'm just not powerful enough to do so. And so therefore I take short little choppy steps because it means I have to move my legs a little bit less. Is it just that maybe I've got good calf strength or good calf power and I can sort of spring off them using those short little choppy steps? Is it that I'm powering my arms and trying to use my arm strength or upper body mass to try and get a bit of extra oomph out of my steps? We can break it down and go really, really complicated with it. But at the end of the day, we need to be asking that question as to why does my athlete move the way that they do? It's not good enough just to look at how an athlete's moving and say, oh, they move different. We need to fix that. We need to have a bit of an appreciation as to why they do move that way. And then on this topic still of self-organization, regardless of our technical model, so whether we've got the best technical model in the world or whether we've got a terrible, terrible, terrible technical model, any changes that we force on our athletes will result in likely acute reductions in performance and different loading patterns on the body as well. As I said before, as we practice something more and more and more through trial and error, we're going to get better and better and better at it until we find a optimum for our current context at that point in time. If I've practiced and practiced and practiced sprinting, and unfortunately I still look like this, there's a reason as to why I look like that. And if anyone tries to change my pattern, there's a really, really good chance that I'm going to go backwards only because I would have tried that and I would have, in the self-organization process, I would have experimented and probably would have hit positions that you are encouraging me to hit and found that they didn't work for me. So I end up defaulting into what is ideally my most optimum position, and any acute changes, and I say acute deliberately, any acute changes are likely going to result in a decrease in performance, but I'm also then going to be loading different parts of my body. I've gotten good at loading like this and I've gotten good at performing this. If I change that, I'm going to be worse. I'm going to get worse at it and I'm going to start loading other parts of my body too. So I think we need to have a really, really good reason as to why we want to force a different pattern. And I say force deliberately because that's often what we do. We often see something and we say, that's different to the reference standard. I want to change that and I want to make that different, make that look a bit better like the reference. And then we say, no, you cannot move like that anymore. I want you to think about this, or I want you to do this. And we often force our athletes to try and move in a different way without thinking that we're probably going to have an acute reduction in performance. And we're probably going to load their body a little bit differently as well. I guess in this example as well, key point being, let's just assume that I have real sucky terminal hip extension, strength, power, rate of force, whatever you want to call it, but I suck at terminal hip extension because I'm a power lifter and I never load that. If you cue me, if you tell me to try and really push hard behind me, push the track away from me, I don't have that physical capacity, and that's probably going to be a terrible cue for me because it's not there. The reason I'm running like I am is because I don't have that capacity to do that. And so that's where knowing the why is probably going to influence, or definitely going to influence, how we go about solving this problem. A neat little case study as well. And I want a little disclaimer at the start. I didn't have heaps to do with this guy, but I certainly spoke a lot about him. He was a 16-year-old male sprinter. The squad that he trained with, it was found that he had a really, really poor cadence relative to the rest of the squad. He had a huge stride length. He'd take really, really big, long strides, but just wouldn't spin his legs very, very quick at all. And it was quite an outlier compared to everyone else. So his coach worked on trying to force higher cadences. And I say force because it was every time he ran, it was thinking about trying to get that higher cadence, thinking about trying to spin the legs while sprinting. So he did this for nearly 12 months. Probably about 9 months into this, he adopted this really, really weird internal external rotation pattern with his stance phase foot, which his coach had never seen, and I hadn't seen much of, if at all, either. And it was just this really, really weird. He'd put it down, I think, from memory into a very internally rotated position where it was almost at like 45 degrees. And then he'd externally rotate really, really forcefully as he stepped through into a 45-degree external rotation position. It was just really weird. And none of the other athletes looked like that. And he didn't look like that 9 months earlier. Sure enough, his cadence improved, but his speed did not. And so we've tried to force this athlete to adopt something that he's just not capable of doing. And in doing so, you know, his one, we'll call it abnormal technical aspect at the start of this whole process has improved, but now he's found some other really weird way of achieving that that's probably not very good either. So his cadence has improved at the detriment of something else. And then obviously his speed hasn't. And then towards the end of this, to top it all off, he suffered a hip flexor injury of all things while sprinting as well. So we've been forcing this really, really high cadence for him. And his hip flexors obviously just couldn't keep up. And we probably know they couldn't keep up because they might have been contributing to this really, really random internal external rotation type thing. So again, why does my athlete move this way? This is again, I only had a small part to do with this guy. I helped him with his hip flexor stuff, speaking about him during this, but chances are he ran with a low cadence because that worked for him. He might have had weak hip flexors or not very powerful hip flexors at the start. He might have had not a great capacity to push behind him. And so therefore maybe had to take shorter steps of some sort. You know, there's all sorts of reasons as to why this could be happening that I don't have the answers for in this case. But the key point being that we've forced him to try and move in a way that didn't work for him. And then obviously he started to break down and started picking up some other interesting habits. So I think a bit of a summary there. It's forcing changes in movement patterns. We need to be very, very careful with that. It can be useful to, we just need to be careful forcing changes. I think it can be useful to force an athlete with some of their back off work. So maybe our hip flexor guy before, maybe to finish off his session, he should have done some repeat high knees work, or he should have done some tempo runs focusing on some high knees stuff. Because that can be a good stimulus for coordinative and or strength power development. I know some people would argue that coordination and strength are more or less the same thing, but sort of somewhat separate them at the moment. But maybe doing a bit of forced work could be good. It's probably better though if we suggest new patterns to athletes. So again, let's assume our previous guy had a weak hip flexor, hence why he's doing his hip flexor and hence why you're below cadence. Let's develop his physical characteristics, i.e. his hip flexor strength or hip flexor power. Let's give him the opportunity to practice with very, very minimal coaching and feedback, and just let him self-organize to you know, what our desired solution, what our desired pattern is going to be. If we can make his hip flexors stronger or increase their power or do something there, give him heaps of time to practice and then see what emerges after self-organization there. I think that's a much more sustainable, a much better model rather than trying to always force our athletes and force them. Otherwise, they end up, I guess, somewhat like him, where his performance hasn't improved at all and he's broken down. Now we're going to move on to, I guess, how should our athletes move? We've touched on, I guess, the importance of the why. We will dive into that a little bit more later on. But now it's a case of how, and I guess what is optimal. We've got our Altis kilogram method again. Altis spelt wrong there, ALTIS, idiot. They suggest, obviously, they've got their own what is optimal, and it's extremely detailed. One singular section here for the toe-off frame, so one of their 5, this is all the key dot points that you need to tick off and you need to have achieved. Imagine trying to go through this list with your athletes and trying to, I guess, get them being 110% with this. It would just be impossible. And not only impossible, we wouldn't want to. The amount of effort that you'd have to put in there just to get them being technically optimal or technically perfect or something like that, it just wouldn't be a great return on investment. So we kind of need a better strategy for figuring out what is optimal, but then also, I guess, maybe better defining what is optimal as well. I think this might be the first paper that I've cited today, and it's a good one. I would really, really encourage more or less everyone to have a read of this. So take a screenshot, take a photo, write it down, do something. Or if you're watching this on YouTube afterwards, pause and search for it. This is a fantastic paper because it sort of goes into some of the issues with what we think optimal means, or our standard definition of optimum, and whether it's actually possible to find optimum. They sort of go into the whole degrees of freedom problem where our hip can do so many movements, our knee can do so many movements, our ankle, our foot, some of the joints within our foot include our arms. We've got so many degrees of freedom, so many ways we can move, that it's almost impossible to suggest that we have the brain power to ever figure out what is perfect for every single athlete. And it kind of suggests like, why even bother putting time and effort into that, knowing that we're never going to find it as well. So I'd really, really strongly encourage you to have a read of this. It sort of changed the way I think a little bit. It was probably a thought process I already had at the time, but strongly recommend you have a read of this because I think aiming for optimum is more or less impossible. I think we've got to try and identify what are the non-negotiables, what are the things that people have to be doing, and then observe that there's probably going to be a fair bit of bandwidth of things that we just can't control, things that we have to leave, things that we have to let our athletes play with. So as I just said, we need to figure out what sprinting kinematics are non-negotiable, what can be negotiated. So what must occur to guarantee that you run fast, and what can be left to vary. And for those of you who get excited about some friends, I think that's probably what I'm alluding to here, but trying not to use those terms. We want to know what things must happen and what things we can negotiate, what things we can leave up to the athlete. And I like this little quote that I've got down here. We want variability of movement to achieve stability of outcomes. Let's just say your goal is to sprint, have a very consistent, very good 20-meter sprint time. We need to have the right variability of movement such that we can guarantee that. Hence, a beginner athlete might have a very rigid movement pattern. They might always run exactly the same way. And so if a wind comes and knocks them off balance, they're stuffed. They've got no variability there to compensate. Whereas an elite, a few different ways they can run. And so all of a sudden a gust of wind comes, or they step on a rock or something on the ground in front of them. They can vary their pattern and then still achieve that stability of outcomes or stability of performance. They still run quick. They still achieve that same time. So we need to figure out what are the negotiables, what are we allowing to vary, and what things are we trying to keep rigid every single time someone sprints, every single step that they take. Here's a few fancy papers that I wouldn't encourage you to read all of them, but I think it's an interesting topic and one that we actually have a little bit of research on. So again, if you want, take a quick screenshot here. I'm not going to go into the specifics of these papers, otherwise I'm going to be here forever. But general summary is that faster athletes typically exhibit less lower limb or less leg variability during the stance phase than slower athletes do. So when their foot is down on the ground, they're always doing the same thing. If you're fast, every single step, you're always going to do exactly the same thing when your foot's on the ground, more or less. Additionally, or conversely, faster athletes exhibit more lower limb variability during the swing phase than slower athletes. So when their legs up in the air, especially during the flight phase, they have a very variable way of doing that. They change it every step, more or less. No step is exactly the same when they are swinging that leg through. When their foot's on the ground, it's all very consistent. When their foot's up in the air, it fluctuates and it varies, and it allows them a bit of flexibility. So my little interpretation down the bottom there is fast athletes will typically manipulate and vary their swing phase mechanics to try and achieve consistent and invariable stance phase mechanics. So they're going to do their swing leg however the hell they want to guarantee that when their foot's on the ground, they're getting shit done. As a bit of a summary there, I guess. And it sort of makes sense, I guess. When your foot's on the ground, that's when you're accelerating yourself, and you kind of want that to be the most important phase or the most consistent phase. when the leg is swinging through, when both your legs are up in the air, there's kind of not much you can do to make yourself go faster other than prepare for the next phase. So if we kind of combine that, the fact that stance phase mechanics must be kept under relatively tight control, and swing phase mechanics we can sort of leave to fluctuate to a degree, combine that with the recommendations proposed by Altus, which is spelled correctly there, in their kilogram model, and now we kind of have a model that is a bit less specific, but more flexible and can more easily be applied to a larger range of athletes. And this is where we sort of lead into the two-frame kilogram here, which is exactly the same as what we said at the start, but we're just identifying the two most important frames here, which is two of the frames where they have their foot on the ground. We're looking at the stance phase because, according to Altus and sort of according to some of this research, we should be able to roughly predict what they're going to do in their swing phase, and or not even care about what they do in their swing phase, as long as during the stance phase they're doing all the right things. And that's where, if we refer back to the kilogram method, have a look at what they suggest for these two phases, the toe off and the touchdown phase. Those are probably the things that we need to be looking at and we need to be ensuring. And then everything else we can let them pick and leave that vary to a degree. Don't leave too much variation. Don't let them do whatever the hell they want, but we can probably not touch the rest of it. So focusing and read the kilogram method. It goes into detail with this. This is probably not the key point of this presentation, but key things we're looking at are thigh separation. Are their thighs separated? You don't want them too close together during the toe off phase here. Where's their forward contact distance? So how far forward is the foot? How far back is the foot? Looking at a ready lower limb as soon as it hits the ground. You don't want to be too flexed. You don't want to be too relaxed. It needs to be a nice, stiff, strong limb that's attacking the ground. Where's the swing leg? It's swinging through and is ideally parallel with or right next to the stance leg as well. Looking at shoulder position, we want good shoulder separation as well. Looking for a neutral torso, etc. They go into a lot of detail, arguably again too much detail, but I think if we focus our attention on what the athlete does when their foot's on the ground, that's going to be a winning strategy. So that's the shitty part. Sorry, that's the really complicated, the complexity. That's the complicated part of the talk here. From here, it all gets easier, but we need to have that understanding before I start talking about sprinting and hamstring injuries, because I think without this complexity, I'm going to leave you all confused. So summary, technical models, i.e. the Altus kilogram method, is an extremely useful starting point, but we need to be cautious with how we interpret the results, as they show problems, but not the source of the problem. Every athlete's going to have their own self-organized optimal, and we need to be cautious trying to force our athletes to abandon these strategies. This is probably one of the main reasons why we have such poor associations between biomechanics and variables such as pain and performance. Everyone moves in a way, if they've practiced enough, everyone moves in a way that is optimal for them and is going to work for them. And so therefore, the fact that we all move differently and yet we all experience, I guess, different or pain and have different performance with different sort of biomechanics and whatnot, the fact that we all have a very different experience there is probably due to the fact that we all self-organize and we figure out what works for us as well. I'm not saying that's the only reason that happens, but I think that's one of the main reasons. And then finally, don't analyze and restrict sprint technical aspects that shouldn't be restricted. Focus on analyzing the parts of the sprint that must be executed consistently. Make the analogy here, if we're talking about a basketball shot. It's obviously arm action, no basketball expert here, but it's the arm action that gets the ball in the ring. If we focus and get our athletes to focus their attention on their footwork and try and keep their feet, or try and keep the jump into the shot, or whatever it is, get them to focus down on what their feet or their legs are doing and disregard the arm action, i.e., keep foot action rigid and consistent and then let the arm action vary, they're going to do shit out. So they're not going to be able to shoot to save their life at all. They need to have their attention on their upper body, attention on trying to execute that shooting motion exactly the same, more or less, or at least parts of it, exactly the same, more or less, every single time, and then let the feet do whatever the hell they need to ensure that that can happen. We just need to make sure when talking about sprinting that we pick the right parts of the sprint to analyze and the right parts of the sprint to sort of keep consistent and keep rigid. Because if we start, I guess, restricting their swing phase mechanics too much, are they then going to have to look for flexibility during the stance phase, which we know needs to be kept relatively consistent and relatively rigid? So what does this look like practically? We'll discuss that in a sec. But for now, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to open up to questions and answers for the time being. Like I said, it's going to get hopefully a bit smoother from here, but I really wanted to get some of that complexity stuff done first. So any questions in relation to that, happy to take them now. If there's stuff that you want to ask hamstring specifically, or maybe the practical application of that, we'll deal with that in a little bit.
I have a cheeky question for you, man. If
Go
my
for
mic's
it.
working.
Yep.
How would you define optimal? Let's define it now, because we've got a room full of coaches and clinicians, and I think it would be good to have a baseline, like a discussion at least about baseline, so that when we all leave here, at least if we can all agree on something that's relatively similar, it sets the tone going forward.
Yep. Yeah, good. I think optimal is always going to be goal specific. What is your goal for something? That's going to dictate, I guess, what is optimal. But at the same time, it also needs to be dependent on who the athlete is, what the task is, what the environment is as well. And I think that paper goes into it really, really nicely. Let's say someone with long legs, they want to sprint fast. They're going to use a very different strategy compared to someone with shorter legs as well. And so they're each going to have very, very different optimal sprinting techniques or sprinting strategies. What is optimal for each athlete is going to be the one that allows them to sprint the fastest, or one that allows them to jump the highest, or whatever their goal is, the movement pattern that allows them to execute that well enough or to the best of their ability. So I don't think we're ever going to have a kinematic, this is the technique, or this is the requisite strength, power, whatever it is that makes you optimal. Optimal is always going to be task dependent, is always going to be environment dependent, always going to be athlete dependent. So one of the key takeaways from the paper is that, every optimal or every context, every setting is going to have a different optimal. And there's no such thing as optimal all the time at all in the slightest. So I guess maybe to answer your question, optimal is whatever gets the job done as best possible for that athlete in that environment with that task or that job, as a very, very general definition. I don't know if we can be more specific than that. Have you got any input on that, Cam? I know this is probably down your rabbit hole that you were chatting about last week.
No, I like that. Part of like my whole ethos is literally taking words that we use in everyday coaching and clinical, and then defining them in a way that respects the root of the word. And you've pretty much touched on that. Optimal is basically defined as most desirable or satisfactory. And as you say, when we talk about function, the context of function, that's always task specific, and there's so much variability between people. So if we can define optimal as the most desirable behavioral output that is task specific to them, as you say, if it's the pattern that makes them run the fastest or jump the highest or shoot the furthest, then that's the physiology that we should be respecting in that. But then you could even take that another step and say that if we're going to be optimizing our minimum standards there, or our most desirable standard, then we'd be looking at finding that minimum standard of acceptable, which again would, as you say, is task specific to the function that we're looking for. So I reckon that's a really good way to define it.
Yeah, nice.
What you've just said, you've summed up really well. Important
as well to think about, as I said, the whole concept of self-organization, where if you practice something enough, you're gonna find a strategy that works for you really, really well right there, right then. It's sort of the concept of that is your current optimum or your current optimal. Now, if we have a good technical model, as hopefully we do, but who knows, if we've got a good technical model, it might suggest that you have an optimum that could be better and that you could be better. And that might make you twice as good. It might make you 10% as good, but it might be different to what you're doing there and then. So I think it's important to consider that the concept of self-organization suggests that you're going to find an optimum that is optimal for you right there, right then, but it might not necessarily be the best that you can be in the grand scheme of things. I think that the paper that I linked by Paul Glazier there dives into that and says that, well, it's probably near on impossible for us to try and come up with technical models that will suggest that if you change all these sorts of things and give it time, that's going to be your optimum long-term, or your optimal sort of in the grand scheme of things. So I think it's important though, just to differentiate that we've got a right here, right now, what is the best way that I can move? And then also if I develop everything that I need to develop, if I work on everything that I need to work on, what is my long-term optimum? Two very different things, two very different optimums there, but very, very challenging for us to try and, with any confidence or any certainty, suggest that long-term optimum is what it is, or is I guess as good as what we think it might be. But two very different things there.
Yeah, I missed the first 10 minutes of the slide, so forgive me if I'm reciting something you've already said. But there's a great paper. I can't remember the authors, but I'll find it and I'll send it to that talks about the difference between block training and random training, where what you're talking about there, how it's like, you know, relative over specific, where you're letting a nervous system self-organize to find its own optimum. I think you'll really like it, but that you've essentially summed that up in terms of like how they dissect verbal cueing, non-verbal cueing, intrinsic cueing, extrinsic cueing, and then turning it from like block practice to random practice.
Nice.
So I think that if
definitely.
you were to take those concepts and then tie them into what you're talking about with optimal, you have not only have you respected the definition, but you've also created a really rich standard for yourself and a good platform to leap from. So that's really, really cool.
Yeah, nice. No, send that through. Absolutely. I'm interested in any sort of reading like that. Any
I'll
other
find it
questions?
now then.
Yeah, Leroy, I'll jump in with a question. This is something that we discussed previously as well behind closed doors. Where do you think that a technical model can be useful for, let's say, a very novice young population, as opposed to what you're talking about, where we're letting more variability and letting more self-organization occur for someone like yourself, who's been playing sport and competed in a variety of different sports, or field-based athletes who are completing speed training more for to improve physical qualities rather than learn a motor skill.
Yeah. So I guess question, let me just make sure I've got it right. Question is, in a novice athlete who hasn't put in the necessary practice and or repetition to allow them to maybe self-organize and to hone in and default on a particular set of movement patterns, how can we use a technical model there? Is that, I guess, question?
Hit the nail on the head.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, great question. I think knowing maybe roughly what the end goal is and starting with a very malleable athlete early on in their development probably allows us to be, and as we discussed, allows us to probably be a bit more forceful, given that they haven't yet developed their own idea of optimum or their own local optimum movement strategy there. And so that's where we could probably be a bit more forceful. We could probably use a few more constraints or I guess force a little more rigid practice on some of the non-negotiables that I am going to talk about soon, so that then hopefully they self-organize into a more successful movement pattern, but more successful movement pattern again being a little bit of a tricky thing to guarantee and say that if they move this way, they're definitely going to be faster. But I think it allows us to train some of the more non-negotiables and set them up hopefully to self-organize into a appropriate pattern much faster than if you start with someone who's already somewhat set in their own ways or not quite as moldable, not quite as malleable as those younger athletes. So I think that's where a technical model can be useful, because it can sort of point us in the right direction. It can be used as a little bit of a guide. But I think that's a very, as I said the other day, that's a very unique case. I don't think there's many other cases where you've got that same flexibility or that same affordances with those young athletes to do so and to force these sorts of models.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
Could I just jump in for a really quick question? It's probably not your question. So do you think when we self-organize, when we do sprint, you said that we default to a certain pattern. Do you think that this pattern is always your current path of least resistance in that moment? And how much of that is kind of depicted upon environment? Because if it's always, there's so many variables involved, that's going to change every single session. So do we just approach it from, or throw everything at it, and then long term you're going to self-organize into hopefully what is a pattern that is going to be the path of least resistance and best for you? Or with that much variability, kind of like, where do you start kind of thing?
I think that was a great statement. I don't know specifically maybe what the question is. I guess maybe is it about trying to deal with people who, field sport athletes will say, who are never really moving the same way twice. They're always moving slightly differently every single time. How do we go about maybe approaching that? Is that sort of where you're coming from there, Joey?
Yeah, more so. Or do you think that default pattern of when you do self-organize, is that always that current path of least resistance?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. Yes, but I think, and I think Bosch and Co talk about this quite well. I think you'll get to a point sometimes where you could sort of self-organize in two different directions or two polar opposite directions, or even more directions as well. And where the direction that you pick, you might say, in my case, when I'm sprinting, I could go down the direction and become a butt kicker and take these really big, long steps and look like an absolute idiot doing so. Or I could head the directions I did and take these really, really short steps that mean I don't really have to move my legs too far or too fast. And you sort of reach a point where you've kind of got to go one way there, and I picked a way in doing so, and then I sort of optimized that direction that I picked. And so I could have easily gone the other way as well, and I could have self-organized a different direction, been in a very different local optimum as well. So I think we don't always default into the path of least resistance right there, right then. You do definitely, your body and your, I guess, motor learning is going to dictate that you pick a direction of least resistance. It might not be the direction of least resistance, but you're going to run with a direction, and you're going to keep practicing and practicing and practicing that until then it definitely at that point in time has become your most optimal solution there. But at some point you're going to hit crossroads, or not even crossroads, more than crossroads. You're going to hit Spaghetti Junction down on Springvale Road there, and you're going to have to pick a direction in some way. And so I guess applying that's in, maybe a more field sport context, applying that in athletes who have to do huge numbers of movements or different movements as well. They're kind of just going to have to pick a movement pattern, pick a way of moving, and then they're going to, with time, mold that and adopt that, and then become good at doing that. But it certainly might not necessarily be the only direction they could go in, and it might not be the only path of least resistance available for them, path of less resistance, I guess. I think probably a bit of a general answer there. I think hard to talk or hard to go into too many specifics with that without maybe having a bit of a specific case study or prompt there. But does that maybe address your question or address your statement there, Joe?
Yeah, mate. Yeah, I didn't have a point of view. It was just a question that came about. So I was just interested into your point and how you're approaching it. But awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I know Bosch talks about attractor wells and talks about hills and valleys and stuff like that. And it's sort of an interesting read, but I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on that. I think there's not many people can say they're an expert on what Bosch thinks other than Bosch himself. But I think there's probably some better answers to that question in that line of thought that I'm not 100% on top of as of yet, but I'll get to one day. Any other questions?
Yeah, I've got one, Leroy. This is probably following on from Joey's question. And this probably is easier to determine in a novice sprinter compared to a elite sprinter, or as that novice sprinter starts to become more elite or competent. How do you determine whether the body is self-organizing or whether you need to do something as a coach to physically cue that particular pattern? So, and it's definitely something that I know I've been kind of toying with in my practice, and definitely something I've had a chat to Jared and stuff about is, when do you, like, particularly probably as the sprinter or the client or the athlete becomes more competent in the task that you're getting them to do, where do you see how do you determine whether the body is in self-organization mode, or when do you, the coach, feel like you need to step in and say A, B, or whatever that thing might be?
Yeah, great question. I think, again, that's probably a case by case basis, more or less. But as I'll sort of go into in the next section to a degree, I think assessing and reassessing a number of different variables is super important. So let's just say we've got an athlete, a relatively experienced athlete who's running a certain way. If we perform our kinegram, perform some other analyses, and sort of come up with here's what's happening, here's the difference, here's what I think I don't like, and here is a possible reason as to why. Now let's run a training intervention and try and address that. Let's try and change some physical quality of that athlete, and then give them the opportunity to practice and self-organize and figure out a new movement pattern with that enhanced physical characteristic. Once we've done that, let's then reassess. Let's have a look. Are they still sprinting the way they did before? Do they still look exactly the same? Have they changed ever so slightly? Have they self-organized and found a somewhat new solution? And then at the same time, let's also reassess physical qualities and say, well, they're not sprinting, or sorry, they are sprinting exactly the same as what they were before. However, this physical quality that I thought was an issue, maybe it's, calf strength, something basic like that. We've aimed to change calf strength. We have changed calf strength. They're still sprinting exactly the same way. And I'm confident I've given them enough opportunity to practice. Maybe then I was chasing the wrong thing. Maybe it wasn't calf strength. Or maybe I need to try and, or if I was really confident it's calf strength or it's something along those lines, maybe I need to be a bit more forceful and I need to intervene there as well. So I think it's a very case-by-case basis, but as I'll go into, you really need to be assessing a lot of different things, I think, to try and figure out how is the athlete moving differently and why might that be the case? And then from there, assess, reassess, was I right? Have I improved that physical characteristic and had it changed? Or are they sprinting a slightly different way? If so, excellent, I've kind of done my job. If not, though, that's when maybe I do need to force something. Maybe I haven't given them enough opportunity or enough different opportunities to self-organize, and we need to start being a little more forceful now and start introducing some more constraints in that case there. But I think it's probably something that you can't comment on unless you spent a little bit of time working with an athlete. I don't think I'd ever pick up an athlete and say, oh, I'm going to force you to move very, very differently. I think you have to have a bit of time with that athlete to try and figure that out, I think.
Yeah, nice.
For the sake of time, I think we might move on to the next part. That part was a bit over half of the presentation, so I am mindful we've probably still got another 20 to 30 minutes left. So I'm going to try and get through the next part relatively, not quickly, but quickly. So now we're going to focus more specifically on hamstring injuries and I guess the relevance of sprinting. So a bit of background info here. We've got our kilogram model here. I think something that we should all be relatively confident with is that hamstring, typically we injure during that terminal swing phase there. So when the shank or our shin is starting to stretch out a little bit, and we've got that lengthening of the hamstring at the knee and also lengthening of the hamstring at the hip as well. So it's typically during these phases here where we do it. We know that as speed increases during the terminal swing phase, our hamstring activity increases exponentially with speed. So if we're running at 70% and we increase our speed by 20%, we might see a 40% increase in hamstring activity. We know that it reaches greater than 100% of its maximum voluntary isometric contraction. So we know that it's working at the large isometric. That increases as well as we increase speed. However, actually reach that sort of maximal stretch. It's, I believe, only ever a little bit longer than what it is in resting, standing, or just when standing. So it doesn't actually reach any superhuman lengths or anything like that. However, that slight increase in stretch, when that put huge in tension or in contraction strength, that the actual strain of the hamstring also increases exponentially as well. And like I said, we know that's due to the increased stretch or length and the increased tensile forces through it. And we know that particularly biceps femoris strain increases as well. Biceps femoris has a slightly larger moment arm at the hip. So when we stretch the hamstrings from the hip, we're going to bias more the biceps femoris there. And that's one of the hypothesized mechanisms as to why we are more likely to injure our biceps femoris compared to any of our other hammies. The other big argument for why we injure biceps femoris is that semitendinosus, the muscle architecture, suggests it's really, really good for high speed contractions. Semimembranosus architecture suggests that it's really, really good for high force contractions, whereas biceps femoris is kind of the middleman that can do a little bit of both, so then tends to get recruited with both high speed and high force activities as well, but is kind of not really good at either of them, is kind of okay at both of them. And then we've sort of got this debate as well, is it isometric or is it eccentric during that terminal swing phase? And it's kind of impossible to know unless anyone's prepared to have a little strain gauge of some sort inserted into their hamstring while they're sprinting. So we're probably not going to find out the answer to that question anytime soon. However, given that sprinters will sometimes take anywhere from 4 to 5 steps every single second, and that the terminal swing phase probably accounts for around about a quarter to a fifth of that overall stride. The hamstrings only have about 50 to 80 milliseconds to do their job. So I think it makes sense that we're probably using a very isometric dominant stretch shortening cycle to be able to actually be strong in that 50 to 80 milliseconds. And my opinion, this is probably more opinion than anything else based on what I've read, is it's probably an isometric contraction until it isn't, though. So until you're sprinting too fast or doing something too silly, that then all of a sudden you don't have that maximum voluntary isometric contraction strength, and then it becomes an eccentric contraction, and that's probably where things may start to fall apart. There's also some evidence that hamstring injuries occur during early stance phase, but the overwhelming evidence suggests late swing phase. Could be a case of both. There might be a small number of hamstrings that occur when you do hit the ground right at the start of ground contact. But I think the evidence suggests that most are done during the late swing phase. And then finally, just some quick low-hanging fruit before we start getting on to sprint biomechanics specifically. We all know that sprinting can be a vaccine for hamstring injuries, and Jordan Mendeguccia had a really, really good paper comparing sprints with Nordics earlier in the year. It was good in some ways, but more or less showed that sprinting can produce, decent sprinting sessions can produce similar adaptations to Nordics, and we know from other papers as well, can reduce your injury risk. We know that rapid changes in sprint loads are probably not great for hamstrings, but they're generally not great for lower limb injuries anyway. There's a million different ways to quantify, changes in sprint loads. We're all familiar, I'm sure, with the acute to chronic workload ratio, which has its pros and has its cons, and there's certainly many, many different combinations of variables that you can look at there to try and calculate what is a good change in volume, what is not a good change. But we know generally that changes in sprint loads are not great for the hammies. And we also know that there's an optimization between too much and too little movement variability and injury risk. So the novice athlete who, whenever they run, every single step is completely different and they're all over the shop, they've got too much coordination variability there, and they're probably at an increased injury risk, versus maybe some of the sprinters who I've worked with before, who every single time they run, it's exactly the same. Every single step is picture perfect, mirror perfect, exactly the same as what it was previously. They probably don't have enough variability there. So every single step they take, they're loading exactly the same muscles, exactly the same structures, exactly the same way every single time. So it's that healthy balance between the two, where when we run, when we do stuff, we want to have a little bit of variability, but we don't have too much variability. On to the kinematics now. I think this is the exciting stuff. Prospective versus retrospective, just very quickly, because I'm going to talk about prospective studies and retrospective studies. Prospective is when we start with a cohort of uninjured people and then we see who's going to be injured. Retrospective is where we start with a cohort of already injured people and then we go backwards to try and figure out what happened. Prospective, generally the gold standard. So prospective findings, we've got, I'm going to try and power through here. General summary, we've got sweet FL studies, unfortunately. There's 5 studies out of the million that have been done looking at 37 hamstring injuries prospectively. So they've analysed a few cohorts and then they've found 37 hamstring injuries that have happened. So that's literally it. What these studies have found is that there's some differences in anterior pelvic tilt, lateral trunk sway, and knee excursion, or how much that swing leg kicks forward during that terminal stance phase. However, really only a few degrees difference there between those who've gone on to injure and those who don't go on to injure. So it's kind of impossible to try and predict anything or assess anything there. We know that as well, there's reduced glute and anterior core, i.e. hip flexors and rectus abdominis generally. EMG activity during the terminal swing phase as well, which sort of fits with that anterior pelvic tilt and that loss of, front side mechanics, or that loss of anterior core control, if you want to call it that. But we also know that all athletes in one of these studies had major asymmetries in their stride characteristics. And these asymmetries were not associated with injury risk or sprint performance. So I think we just need to be careful when we're looking for asymmetries there, because asymmetries are almost normal. And so even major asymmetries were quite normal as well. A couple of pictures here. First picture, A is those who were uninjured, B is those who went on to injure. And we can sort of see there's a bit of a trunk change in position there. However, they didn't look at trunk change in position. They only looked at changes in anterior pelvic tilt, of which they found that there was a slight difference or a slight increase in anterior pelvic tilt by a few degrees. I'm unsure whether they looked in reference to the trunk or whether it was just looked in reference to what is vertical. But they cited that there's really only a few degrees difference there. Similarly, looking here, C is those who didn't go on to injure, D is those who went on to injure. This one's somewhat visible, but again, I challenge you to look at that while sprinting. During the terminal swing phase, they had that greater trunk angle there. And then I've got a little picture down the bottom here of, just in case you're not aware, when we anteriorly pelvic tilt, we're going to increase length and therefore tension through hammies as well. Hence why anterior pelvic tilt has, on a couple of different occasions, been linked with hamstring injury. Additionally, as well, in the paper by Cornelia Dabrowski, they found that when you cast the shin out and really step out in front of yourself and expose the knee or take the hamstring through a greater range at the knee as well, that was also linked with risk of hamstring injury going forward too. But again, only by a few degrees. So we've got these fantastic studies here, but we've got to be really careful with what we do with them because they were all very, very minor, very subtle differences. I think blog here by Cam Jossi, I think it's pronounced, the butt kicking epidemic. I think he more or less, from an experiential point of view, rather than a research point of view, is more or less identified with these anyway. Probably not him, but other people have as well, of that casting of the leg out in front of you, that huge anterior pelvic tilt. And I'm sure if we looked from front on, this guy's shifting side to side as well. So it's that matching up between what we know from experience point of view, as well as what the research has proven as well. However, we just need to be careful again with our interpretation. Lots of people run like this without going on to suffer hamstring injury. But of the people who do suffer hamstring injuries, most of them have a pattern that is somewhat similar to this. So hard to then predict and say he's going to suffer or she's going to suffer a hamstring injury. Hence important, I guess, trying to be careful what we do with that information. Looking at retrospective, so this is where they've said, here's a group of 20 people who've injured their hamstrings. Let's go back and look at what's happened. There's a lot of studies here, but they're all very, very different. So we've got to be careful there. And you can't necessarily infer cause relationships as well with these types of studies compared to prospective as well. Additionally, there was a lot of variability in terms of when they looked at these hamstring injuries. Was it at 1 to 2 years after? Was it at 3 to 6 months after? Was it at 2 months after? And they more or less found a very similar thing. They found that they're a bit more butt kickerish, where they've got that anterior pelvic tilt and they don't quite get the knee and hip up as high. They had altered EMG activity as well through hamstrings, glute erectors, anterior core. And I say altered again because it was sort of a little bit hit and miss. Some people did some things, other people did other things. They had reduced acceleration as well, but not top speed. And they found that this tended to last until about 8 to 12 weeks after injury. So this might be a useful measure for return to sport potentially, is having a look at an athlete's ability to accelerate using maybe some of the force velocity profiling techniques that guys like JB Moran and stuff pioneered. And we also see that their repeat sprint performance as well is poorer. They fatigue a lot quicker as well. Again, though, when we retrospectively look, we need to be careful. Is it a chicken or the egg? Is it that they accelerate slower because they've just bloody injured their hamstring? Or is this a important and useful thing to look at as a maybe something that's going to lead on to recurrent hamstring injuries as well? We're nearing the end here. Sorry, guys. Practical value. So what can't we do with the information that I've just presented? I've talked about anterior pelvic tilts. I've talked about lateral trunk slays, about that casting out of the shin. We need to be careful with these technical models, as we've discussed. So the Altus model and other similar ones. We can't really assess these things as well that I've just spoken about without using a Vicon or some other sort of similar marker capture, motion capture technology. And even if we could, they've got really, really poor predictive power from these variables too. It's kind of hard to inform injury risk as well when they are very, very subtle differences. And then on top of that as well, it's a case of why would we look at these? Why would we not look at some of the very, very simpler or more simple things too? And this paper down the bottom here, I think, is a good read, is somewhat relevant as well, where it's really, really hard to screen at the best of times, let alone with things with such poor research backing as our sprint technique stuff, where we've got something like 37 hamstring injuries that we've looked at. Compare that with, a one-off study down at Aspetar, where they might have as many as 100 to 200 hamstring injuries in one study or something like that. So it's really a drop in the ocean. We need to be careful with taking the specifics here too much. However, we can better understand the contributing factors to hamstring injury, obviously. We can better understand what extremes to look out for. So when we do our kilogram analysis, we can see, oh, he looks really weird or she looks really different. That's probably a thing. We can also better stress test these postures. So if our athlete drops into an anterior pelvic tilt really, really quick, that's an issue. Let's try and stress test that and make them a little bit more robust or a bit more resilient there so that they don't drop into that anterior pelvic tilt straight away. We can then obviously better direct our training at trying to reduce these things or I guess stop these things from happening through the process of self-organization and whatnot. And then knowing that there's certain things as well that take a while to resolve after a hamstring injury too, we can then better direct our rehab and consider monitor these things as well. Is it a chicken or the egg though? Obviously we need to be careful, but I think if we've got cheap and very easy ways to test this stuff, which we do, then we'd be silly not to anyway. So part 3, this is what do I do? This is very much the practical side of things. I think I've gone into why is sprinting complex, and hopefully that's really, really obvious. I've gone into some of the key things from a biomechanics or a kinematic point of view. I say key things, not really key things, but what we do know at the moment. Now it's sort of what do I do? First of all, step 1 is we need to assess, obviously. I like a 2-frame stance phase kinegram. Those are the ones that I shared earlier. So we need to look at the positions that we want to keep really, really consistent, such as the stance phase ideally. I like sprint performance measures, such as max velocity, max acceleration, which I'm playing with at the moment using GPS units. So I'm going to get back to you on that. That's something I'm working at the moment. And then 10, 20, 30 meter times as well. All things that are true sprint performance measures. Separate to that is our stride characteristic measures, stride length and frequency, flight time, contact time. These are not performance measures. If someone increases their stride length, but it's come at the expense of their stride frequency, they haven't gotten faster. Hence, it's not a true sprint performance measure. And there's a lot of variability associated here. I like looking at these though, because it tells you how someone moves. And if you work on it or train it or do something, it's nice to know what exactly have you influenced there. Strength measures, so using isometric single leg calf raise, squats, isometric single leg calf raise, a single leg squat, hip thrust, hip flexion, and hammy bridge, assessing strength of all those areas. And looking at power measures as well. So a single leg half dominant rebound plyo and a single leg knee dominant rebound plyo. I'm currently exploring hip and hammy options, but it's kind of hard. I was going to talk about how I do that, but I'm going to skip that for the time being. If anyone's really, really interested in that, I have to go about it. I'll talk about it later. Step 2 is the diagnostics, and this is an art that I'm working on, trying to develop into a bit more of a repeatable thought process. More or less, it aims to answer the question, why does my athlete move the way that they do? We need to consider the physical qualities, how much self-organizing they've done. So like the question earlier of what do we do with athletes who have had no practice and have done nothing? We need to think about what are their problems while sprinting as well. That's where we compare them to the reference stand and think, well, what's the differences there? And I think 90% of the time I have several working diagnoses. I have several reasons as to why they might be moving why they are. I think it's impossible to pinpoint the single reason. I think it's very rarely a single reason. And we need to try and consider what are our working diagnoses or what are our multiple reasons that we think it is and try and address them all. Step 3, obviously, training interventions. We've assessed, we've diagnosed what we think might be wrong with them or why they might move the way that they move. We then need to consider all athletes need to be good at the determinants of sprinting, which for me is that rapid application of triple extension forces to the ground. So being able to hit the ground hard and propel yourself forward, the rapid exchanging of limbs, being able to switch your limbs, being able to switch that stance leg with that swing leg really, really rapidly, and then trying to sequence those two activities as smoothly as possible. You don't want it to be these big bound, where, yeah, you're applying force really, really quickly and rapidly exchanging the limbs, but it's a very clunky movement. It needs to be smooth. And ALTIS have their own determinants of sprinting, which are more or less the same as mine. They talk about projection, rhythm, and rise, similar to what I've said, just their fancy take on it as well. I think there's probably no right or wrong. I think we're all roughly on the same page there anyway. So we need to train those determinants. We need to train the things that make people sprint fast. We then need to aim to improve the hypothesized physical characteristics that are the source of the problem. So our hypothetical, or our young sprinter who injured his hip flexor, we need to work on hip flexor strength, power, endurance, capacity, etc. So ideally we use our kinegram and athlete subjective to screen what the problem is. And then the rest of the assessment aims to identify what the source of the problem is so that we can intervene and we can address that through gym, through plyometrics, through some forced sprint work after a session, etc. And then hence we want to aim to improve our identified physical characteristics through training methods that are also going to influence these key determinants determinants here. So it's no good doing really heavy, deep squats if your goal is to try and work on triple extension power, triple extension, greater force development when you're sprinting really, really fast. Our training methods that we want to try and improve our physical characteristics with must respect these determinants here. And then finally, we need to give our athletes as much opportunity for self-organisation as possible. They need to figure out what their new optimum is now that we've enhanced some of their physical qualities. We want lots of minimally coached practice to encourage trial and error. We need to pick and choose our cues very carefully. So in the case of myself, where I just really wasn't extending the hip and pushing behind me very much, likely because I suck at hip extension power, because I never do it. If you tell me to push harder, push further, try and take longer steps, push the ground away from behind me, I'm going to break down because I can't do that. And that's why I run the way that I run. So we need to pick our cues very carefully there. And then we want to have lots of different variations of the movement. If you always get someone running in a straight line and that's all that they've ever done, then they're going to get really, really good at that. And they're going to find a strategy that works for that. But then as soon as you ask them to do something different again, they're going to break down and they're going to have to try and find a different strategy. So I think it's important that we keep a bit of variation there, such as running in a straight line, running on a track, running on grass, running on bitumen, running around a bend, running up hills, running with a sled, all sorts of different variations on whatever the base movement is, i.e. sprinting, so that then they can sort of cancel out the noise and figure out what needs to be done in each of those, such that then whatever skills we can impart on them are hopefully transferable across many, many different types of movements. Finally, we want to reassess. We want to make sure that the assessment stuff I spoke about before, and to, I guess, answer the question earlier as well, is we want to reassess the kilogram, obviously, to see, are they moving with a different strategy? At the same time, we want to assess their physical characteristics. Have we enhanced strength? Have we enhanced power? Are we finding that our interventions are affecting those physical characteristics? And then are those physical characteristics transferring through to their sprint as well? And then obviously we want to see changes in sprint performance. And that's probably something I haven't spoken about much, but at the end of the day, more often than not, we're trying to get our athletes faster. And if we're not assessing whether we're making them faster, then that's probably the biggest, the most important thing to be assessing is, are we succeeding at making our athletes faster? And how they achieve that is probably not quite as important as, are they getting faster, yes or no? I've got, maybe we'll just go through, I had a few case studies. Let's just do the very simple, very basic case study that is myself here that I've gone on about more or less. This is me, like I said, ages ago, started a year back when I was a bit of a noob at this, and I still have a bit of a noob, but more of a noob than I am at the moment, where I have really, really minimal hip extension range on both legs, maybe a little bit more on this left side compared to the right. My why as to that is happening is, like I said, I'm a powerlifter, I squat and I deadlift, I never really load heavy, I never really have to work hard at that terminal hip extension, hence it makes sense that I'm kind of sucky at terminal hip extension and I can't produce any force there. Hence my strategy is going to reflect that. I'm going to take these really, really short steps. I'm going to try and spin my legs really, really quick if I can, because I just get no push behind myself from this position here. What I've then done over the last, I will say 4 months, maybe even longer, 5 months, lots of sprinting, obviously, lots of different distances, lots of different cues, lots of different thoughts, tried to keep it variable. I've done some hill running, I've done some sled running, lots of plyometric work as well, lots of different strength work compared to what I had done previously. But when I am sprinting and when I'm doing max velocity, I try to somewhat relax and just let it happen. And however it happens, it happens. I don't want to try and force that, otherwise I'm going to end up with issues. If we look specifically at the hip now, this was taken a couple of weeks ago. All of a sudden, I've got this big, huge backside mechanic here, running faster, running with a different type of movement pattern. I've somewhat been testing myself from a strength and power point of view as well at work, and found that most of my power metrics are up, most of my strength metrics are stable / down. But through, I guess, the process that I've described thus far, I've been able to change myself from this to this without forcing anything, through suggesting an alternate movement pattern by giving myself the requisite strength, power, endurance, and whatnot to enable that movement pattern, and then through just practicing and letting things just happen more or less relatively naturally. So I'm going to wind it up there. I do have a few more case studies, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to leave it there. And yeah, open up the floor to any questions.
I've got one. Leroy, can you hear me? All right.
Yes, I
Yeah,
can.
it's Finn, by the way.
Sorry. Oh, Finn. Hey, Finn. How you going,
Hey,
mate?
Leroy, how you going? Yeah, I think this is interesting because I guess we've had a few conversations about this sort of thing over the last few months. So it's good to see what you've come up with, and it's made a lot more things make sense in my head. So thanks for the presentation. I've been talking with Adam, who's here as well, a little bit about the like control chaos continuum, and it just sort of clicked with me today that, I guess, would you say that self-organization is maybe like the mechanism for improvement in something like a control chaos situation? And if so, because you were saying, I really like that phrase you had before about, I think it was movement variability leads to stability of outcomes or something like that.
Yep.
In that case, for something that's as controlled as sprinting, how would you sort of implement chaotic elements into your training to almost, is it a matter of like progressively overloading something like chaos to increase that person's ability to self-organize or demand self-organization?
Yeah,
and
nice.
then and sort of stimulate that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, nice. I think first, two-part question there, obviously. First part, self-organization within a chaotic environment. Absolutely. I think that's absolutely what happens. And there's quite a few people who sort of suggest that it's almost not the solution you come up with that's important in those chaotic environments. It's almost the process of figuring out a solution that's more important. And so if we put you in a chaotic environment and told you to figure out what the best movement is or figure out what the best pattern is there, you might figure out a shit pattern and you might get beaten every single time for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But if you keep putting yourself in those chaotic environments, practicing that self-organization process and practicing that finding of solutions, you're eventually going to improve your ability to find a solution. And you would hopefully find that with time, your ability to find solutions becomes better, such that then the solutions that you are finding are obviously better as well. So I think absolutely it's almost a case of the self-organization process itself is almost more important there rather than the actual solution that it produces. The second part, how do we make sprinting a bit more chaotic, is a great question, and I think a necessary question too, given that I'm assuming most of us are coming from team sport backgrounds. A little chat that I had with Seaton actually, and something that's quite interesting is, I think we can influence sprinting and movement patterns a lot easier than what we think. If you have a look at the 2009 100 meter world champs, where Usain Bolt broke the record and set at what it is currently at the moment, 9.58 or whatever it is. Him and Tyson Gay, I think it is, first and second. When they're running, there's quite a few points in time where they sync up their stride rate, where they all of a sudden it just almost looks like it glitches, and then they both move perfectly in sync for a few seconds, and then they relax and they do their own thing, and then all of a sudden back on track and they're moving perfectly in sync. And there was a really interesting analysis wrote on it that sort of talked about the chances of that happening. And they said chances of that happening is more or less sweet F all. But they did it a number of times within the race. And their thought process then was, is it that just having that little bit of contextual interference, that little bit of something slightly different is enough actually to force us to try and then adopt a slightly different solution, Was it, well, Usain Bolt in front of Tyson Gay there, so Tyson Gay must have been responding to Usain Bolt. Usain Bolt probably couldn't see backwards and see what Tyson Gay was doing, but Tyson Gay's mechanics being affected quite significantly just by the fact that Usain Bolt is there and he's having to try and, not try and sync up, but almost inadvertently syncing up there. So I think sometimes we can make it more complicated than it needs to be. Simply running with someone might be enough to induce some sort of chaos sort of stimulus, but a very mild one. Otherwise, it could be a case of introducing things like a cat and mouse game where, you've got someone 2 meters behind you trying to catch you. It could be chucking some sort of cones out in front where then the person in the front of that cat and mouse game picks a left or a right, and the person behind's got to try and chase and has to have some sort of high speed reaction there as well without, changing the angles too much. Maybe it's a case of sprinting in many different environments, which is not truly chaotic or reactive, but sprinting around a bend, sprinting up a hill, sprinting down a hill, just trying to vary that where possible as a very mild form of chaos as well. Maybe it's chucking a ball in their hand, getting them sprinting with the ball. I think there's many different ways we can change their usual pattern. And then, actually the other thought process would be just make sure they're doing it in game as well. Make sure you're setting up sport-specific drills too, where they have the option to run quick in the context of their game as well. So I think there's a few options there. Sprinting probably a harder one to come up with chaos for, though, compared to say some other movement patterns, change of direction, jump land patterns, things like that. Sprinting, you're doing a lot of distance to actually get up to max velocity there. But yeah, definitely a few variations there. There's a recent paper as well that came out probably a few months ago that had the chaos continuum, I think. I know Joey sort of touched a bit on this too. Recent paper by someone where they more or less came up with like a bit of a periodized program as to how you can periodize the chaos exposure. I can't remember who by. But yeah, no, great questions. I hope that sort of answered them somewhat.
Yeah, awesome. I guess speed training has got to be 100%. So any big changes are going to take away from that ability to perform at 100%. So mild variability in the movement. Yeah, awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Leroy.
Good point. I didn't think of that as well. Yeah, you don't want to obviously change things up too much. Otherwise you are going to slow yourself down, and then all of a sudden you're not actually working at max velocity. You're not actually getting that max velocity stimulus. You're probably going to have a lot more flexibility to move, but you're not actually going to be moving as quick as you can.
I've got a question, but first off, thanks, Leroy. That was awesome. There was probably about 30 or 40 light bulb moments throughout that presentation. So I'm definitely going to chase you up on some things, but just something I'm trying to wrap my head around. It might be just because I'm very systematic in how my thought processes are, but kind of going off what Finn kind of questioned you on is, I find it hard to kind of wrap my head around that if we just expose an athlete to a chaotic condition, that the optimal or their subjective optimal kind of movement pattern exists within that chaotic condition without first exposing them to kind of a robust kind of process where they're probably about able to critically analyze what is the right movement for them. So I'm trying to wrap my head around, can we actually just throw an athlete into a chaotic environment and then trust that their self-organization process will default to that path of least resistance without a motor skill or motor learning kind of process or staged process occurring?
Yeah, good question. And I think it might have been myself and Seaton were having a similar discussion, but almost the opposite way after listening to you talk, and sort of the systematic approach of, well, I think Seaton might have asked you the opposite question of, can you just throw them in the chaotic end? So great question. Before I launch into that, do you sort of agree maybe with my rambling earlier of the idea of a local optimum right there, right then, as a very, very different sort of, this is where they could be if we find the right technical model and change the way they move over a more chronic training / whatever period. Do you sort of, does that resonate with you, Joey? Do you agree that they could self-organize and find something that works for them right there, right then, but that's going to be a very different, end goal or what could be their end goal? Is that something you agree with?
Yeah, definitely. 100%. That's what I agree. And my thought process is, if you can train an athlete's ability to kind of be a lot more fluid in what is their subjective optimum in that specific environment, whether it's in that minute, whether it's in that second, whether it's in that week or whatever, the more fluid they are and the more robust they are in what that is, I think that's what separates what a good athlete or a fast sprinter, or the ability of elite sprinters have. I think you touched on it. You said that if they are exposed to a wind gust or something, their ability to adjust and maintain that speed, I think that's exactly the difference between a novice and an elite sprinter. So I definitely agree with that point. That's where I kind of, so I'll let you go because that's where kind of I fall, because I agree with that, and then I go, well, I'm missing a gap, or I'm failing to understand the gap between the two.
Yep. Yeah, and so that's where maybe we don't have a difference of opinion at all. My thought would be, how do we know? How could we ever possibly tell? And that's where the paper from Paul Glazier that I referenced right at the start. How can we ever possibly know what is the end goal? What is the most optimum or the best way that an athlete can move? How do we ever figure that out? That would be the challenge I have for myself anyway, is how do we know that if we change some technical aspect of the athlete that they're going to move faster or they're going to perform better there at all? If we did, let's just assume that we do have a great technical model for that, then I agree 100% with your approach, your more systematic approach of let's train what we want to see, or let's train aspects that will then facilitate their transition towards that end goal. But I just question whether, and as does that paper I quoted at the start, I question whether we've got the CPU or the brain power to ever possibly figure out all of the little intricacies as to what is optimal and what is their end goal, what is the end stage of their optimization process. Hence, I think our main difference of opinion is going to be that I would have a very loose end goal, very loose end model, such that there's a few little things in there that I believe strongly in, such as if we're talking about sprinting specifically, athletes need to be able to apply triple extension power/force at, incrementally decreasing contact times. They need to be able to switch their legs or exchange their legs really, really quickly, and they need to be able to coordinate that very, very smoothly. That is almost my end goal. That is my global optimum. That is the best that they can be if we address that. Whereas I think, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I think maybe you have a more specific end goal, or maybe subscribe to a more specific technical model where there's a more precise way or a more controlled way that our athletes should be moving in, that is going to be, at the end of the day, the most optimum they can move in. And I don't disagree with that. I think there certainly is. I just wonder if we have the brain power, or if we have the skills to actually be able to investigate that and actually be able to say with confidence, if this athlete moves that way, then they're going to be better than what they were previously. And so that's where I'm just hesitant to go into specifics there. And I'd much rather just focus on giving our athletes the physical qualities that they need, allowing them time to practice, self-organize, and trend towards some sort of possible end goal there. Whereas I think you think a little bit differently about that, and it's more the systematic way of thinking, and that sort of relies on a more specific way of that end goal, or more specific end goal movement, I think. Apologies if I put words in your mouth there.
No, I think you're probably right. So I think my process is expose that athlete to that technical, systematic approach. And then I think my end goal is what you preach, which is I like self-organize. So it's kind of like I'm taking a systematic approach to giving them the tools to self-organize in that final kind of chaotic moment. Whereas I believe you're a bit more fluid in that entire process. Whereas I'm like, all right, let's just stick to the techniques, stick to that. And then hopefully you have a toolkit that will allow you to self-organize and be a bit more fluid. So exactly, that's where I think we don't differ in opinion. We probably differ in approaches, and there's no right or wrong approach at all.
Yeah, so, I think differ maybe slightly, and I say slightly because I think it sounds like we're definitely on definitely the same page, if not the same line here. Where application, maybe we differ ever so slightly. Maybe there's a little bit more technical focus with yourself, whereas with myself, it's more give them the physical qualities and let them figure shit out to a degree. Yeah. So maybe less specific with the technical stuff. But again, we both embrace that concept of self-organization, letting them figure it out around what we give. So, no, cool.
Love it. That was awesome.
You mind if I just quickly jump in, Leroy, just to add on to what Joey's saying there?
Yeah, but you asked a shit question last time that made me think, so I'm suspicious now.
Oh, shit. I'm just gonna go. So what Joey's talking about, and I've been guilty of this as well, is getting so deep in the technical elements of it that you actually forget that the athlete in front of you is an organism that is made up of squillions and trillions of cells that are actually designed to problem solve on the fly, and all of the systems that those cells make up within the organism are also designed for that as well. And as coaches and clinicians, we can get a little tunnel visiony and maybe even a little bit ego driven in thinking that we can step into somebody's timeline and make a huge impact on their cellular and, I guess, somatic expression in life and make significant changes. But as you say, like, if you just get out of the way of the process and allow for that self-regulation, the nervous system especially is very, very good at driving specific adaptations to an imposed demand. I mean, there's a principle that's based on that very thing. And so when we as coaches understand that if we can just kind of set a bandwidth of acceptable, which is what we were talking about earlier, Leroy, where, we were saying what is optimal. I guess it's the most desirable way from A to B, where we're building robust function within a task-specific pattern. Write that down because that was really good and I just forgot what I said. But I guess that could be optimal, right? And then if we can set that bandwidth and say, look, we know these are our minimum levels of acceptable in terms of what you were saying, like we want stance phase to look relatively similar, and then we want terminal swing phase to look, or maybe it was the opposite. I can't remember. That's how good a student I am. But
swing phase relatively flexible and adjustable, and allowing
a little bit more adaptive. Yeah, cool. So then at least you've got a fixed outcome that allows for fluidity, which is then respecting the hierarchy of neural input. I liken the body to very, very smart hardware running very, very very, very smart software running very, very dumb hardware. So if you just get out of the way of that system and set your bandwidth of acceptability, when something strays outside that bandwidth, that's when, as a coach or a clinician, you can then step in and say, well, we need to nudge that back within our goals, within our goalposts, because we're starting to stray. But if you constrain them too much and try to keep them within the goals, they'll never learn for themselves what it's like to stray out. And then, as Leroy's been saying this whole time, sometimes they'll find a pathway that's more effective for them, which will make their pathway more efficient. But if we as coaches get stuck in thinking that the path of least resistance is the path of most efficiency, then we start training and treating everyone the same when we aren't respecting that sort of high level of variability between everybody.
I like the word nudge as well. We nudge them back in the right direction. I think, what did I say? I said suggest.
Yeah, nudge, don't force. Suggest is a really good one as well.
Yeah, I think I certainly am not advocating that we take a complete step back and do nothing, because I think we're definitely better than that. And I think we've got an important role here. I think we just can't force stuff, or if we are forcing stuff, make sure they're, as Jared said, they're young, impressionable athletes who have no predetermined motor pattern, and we can force them, or make sure that if we are forcing, we've got a bloody good reason as to why we are forcing, or we're prescribing forced patterning stuff appropriately, such as a bit of back off work to finish off with, such as, again, I think I said doing some repeat high knees work as a nice little hip flexor conditioning or overloady sort of, thinking about more through a gym lens, in that we're doing this technique specific work in an effort to try and overload a specific aspect of their body or of their pattern or of their movement process, rather than it being the sole way that we do that, or the sole way that they move, and trying to make them move every single way exactly the same time too.
Alrighty. Leroy, thank you very much for the presentation. Really informative there, and I'm keen to dive into these other case studies, so I'm going to be hitting you up and investigating there. For anyone that wants to get in touch with Leroy, I'll chuck his details up, his Instagram, etc., and where he posts all his good knowledge. This is his passion area, so I'm sure he will be keen to chat to anyone that wants to discuss further. Yeah, thanks for tuning in, and thank you very much, Leroy. I really enjoyed that one, mate.
Beautiful. Again, thanks for having me. And yeah, absolutely, reach out if you've got questions. I spent way too long on this presentation and cut so much shit out because I just got way too excited. So feel free to shoot me a message. I'd love to chat. Absolutely, passion area. So reach out to me socials, or I think I've got my email or something on Instagram or some shit like that. Shoot me an email as well if you want.
Awesome. Thank you.